here, and you're talking about land use and trees.
I am, Brian. I'll start because it pertains to Christmas trees, which you may by now have, or indeed have decided not to have, but nonetheless you will be aware that there are plenty of Christmas trees around at this time of year. So I have on screen just now a slide from the British Christmas Tree Growers Association, and if we click on one, we see that approximately 6 to 8 million Christmas trees are sold in the UK each year. Now, of course, the point that they don't make is that not all of them are homegrown. So we'll have a look now at the Forestry Commission statistics, which are from this year, their facts and figures 2023. And we see, if we click on one, that now 13.4% of the UK's total land area is now covered in woodland. This represents an enormous increase since the commissioning, the inception of the Forestry Commission in 1919, when it was about 4% after the end of the First World War. Of course, we mustn't forget that the Forestry Commission's purpose was to increase timber stock after so much of it was used in the First World War. So what I thought we'd do now is just appraise the situation and see whether we're still on course or not, because, of course, the significant detail for forestry use is that it means that food cannot be grown where forestry is. Going back to the purpose of the Forestry Commission here, Grown in Britain, stating that in the UK we are second only to China in terms of the amount of timber that we import. So it's all very well saying that 13.4% of the UK is covered in timber, but we obviously aren't using it in the way that we might be, because we import £7.8 billion worth of it each year. So the next thing to look at is why that might be the case and what incentives there are for landowners or farmers to grow things other than crops. And I've just taken as an example the England Woodland Creation Offer, the EWCO, and it supports the establishment of new woodlands. Now, already we're veering somewhat off course because, of course, they say that it's funded by the Exchequer through the Nature for Climate Fund to support projects that will help us achieve net zero by 2050. So if we click on one, we'll see that amongst the objectives, and these are the two that I want to concentrate on, are combating climate change by creating new woodlands that store carbon and increasing and improving recreational access in new woodland. So these are being given out at £13,000 per hectare. First of all, then, we'll look at how they're dealing with the so-called carbon emissions side of it and their quest for net zero. So we'll look at the government statistics of greenhouse gas emissions, or at least what they call greenhouse gas emissions. And to highlight the issue, we'll go on and look at the National Atmospheric Emissions Inventory, which is produced annually and has been done since 1990. So with apologies for the minute text, I've got a box here that shows, first of all, the emissions by nature, or at least by industry, and then the second column shows the 1990 figures, and we've then got the previous 5 years, with 2021 being the most recent. And the two red arrows that have just come onto the screen now show the only two negative values here. So what this means is that every single one of these industries is in effect deemed to be producing carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases. And these are the only two that are in effect able to mitigate and work towards the net zero pie in the sky. They are forest land and harvested wood products. Now, what's interesting to note is that over the 30-year period that these tables have been collated, those figures have almost remained static. The forested area has increased slightly, but it's still absolutely minute in comparison with the overall figure. So that's the sort of carbon capture side of it. And the next thing that was talked about was recreation. So on screen now, what I want to do is look at something that the government are calling natural capital. Now, you may or may not have heard of this, but it was updated in July of this year. What exactly is natural capital? Well, we'll go on one and we'll just have a look to see what this is. It includes certain stocks of the elements of nature that have value to society, such as forests, fisheries, rivers, biodiversity, land, and minerals, natural capital includes both the living and non-living aspects of ecosystems. So what they're introducing here is the idea that in some way people will place a value on things that they're not necessarily either engaging with directly or visiting or buying. So we'll go on to the next slide, because specifically within this document, they talk about what they refer to as direct use value. This is where individuals make actual or planned use of an ecosystem service. Okay, fair enough. That's consumptive use refers to the use of resources taken from the ecosystem. For example, food or timber, i.e. something that's tangible, something that you do actually consume. But then they refer to non-consumptive use, which is the use of nature without taking any elements, such as recreation and landscape amenity. Next, we have the option value, which if we just click on one, we'll see is the value that people place on having the option to use a resource or asset in the future, even if they are not currently. An example would be a national park, where people who have no intention to visit it may still be willing to pay something to keep that option open in future. It can be thought of as a form of insurance, such as a wide species mix in a particular habitat as conditions change. And then finally, we look at why put a value on the environment. So the government here is at great pains to say economic valuation is not about looking to sell or commodify nature. It is a useful way of making the relevance and benefits of nature more visible in decision-making. Valuation can help decision makers understand the contribution that an ecosystem makes to an area, or determine whether an intervention is justified, or determine priorities. So we've looked, first of all, at the carbon side of it, and now we've looked at the what's called the natural capital, or indeed the recreation side of it. So the big issue here is what exactly are these forested areas being developed for? Because it looks very much like, from the Grown in Britain statistics, that it's not for the use of timber by way of consumption, as the government would refer to it. But critically, what it is denying, or at least nudging the farmer towards doing, is not growing food and providing grants specifically for growing trees. Now, the purpose of reporting on this is not to suggest that growing trees is an inherently bad idea. It isn't. But what it does bear relation to is the government food strategy, which is now on screen now. If we just take a little bit of text from that by clicking on one, we see that they refer to innovation, and they make much of this. They've committed to spend over £270 million through the Farming Innovation Programme, and they're supporting 120 million in research across the food system. Now, what does that mean? Specifically, they are talking about supporting progress on a wide range of issues, including alternative proteins and gene editing. And we will launch a call for evidence of the use of feed additives to reduce methane emissions from livestock. We will also work with the agricultural sector to develop a What Works Centre to provide farmers with evidence that supports the adoption and on-farm take-up of new innovations. So it becomes quite clear that in actual fact, the government's commitment to looking after farmers, to looking after the environment, to looking after animal welfare is questionable at best. And indeed, it's very hard to see how what they've set out so far does actually protect those things that I've mentioned. So I think it's relevant to look at who wrote the government's food strategy. So we'll bring him on screen now. And he is called Henry Dimbleby, co-founder of Leon, which is a chain of restaurants. And that is, I'm afraid, as close as he has come to the wide-scale production of food and indeed land management. In other words, and I'm not suggesting he sat in his bedroom and wrote this all on his own, but he has no background, or at least legitimate background, in this area, and yet he has devised the food strategy. He also says that before founding Leon, he worked at Bain & Company, which is something that I'm sure Ben Rubin would be willing to comment on in future. And specifically, he talks about his dealings in private equity transactions and helping large companies to develop their strategies. So given that being the case, and indeed the background in what we've looked at by the land use, it seems very hard to imagine that the idea of natural capital is just a theoretical one and that it won't be commodified, as the government say. So this will be something that we definitely be keeping an eye on. But it appears that, going back to the beginning, the espoused values and indeed the aims of the Forestry Commission have been somewhat subverted in the name of climate change, and now what they're referring to as innovation. So we'll be keeping our eyes on this.
Charles, thank you very much. Yes, it seems to me talking about you'll be prepared to pay in order to go into a park. So this clearly seems to meet the Agenda 2030 agenda, where we will be paying for everything and everything will be itemised so that it can be taxed and paid for and taxed. We'll leave it there. I'm going to say, Vanessa, Charles, thank you very much for joining me today. We've run over time a little bit, but important subjects that we've been covering today. So no apology for that. I'd like to say a very big thank you to our audience, wherever you are in the world, and a very, very big thank you to people who are supporting the UK column financially to keep us going. We can only do this with your financial support, so thank you very much. If you're a signed up member with UK columns, stay with us because we'll be doing extra in just a few moments, and I think we'll be having some in-depth discussion on some of the topics that we've covered in the news. We'll end there. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.